All right, Gator fans, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Florida Gators schedule for 2025. It's kind of like a preview, but it's more so about the road games than it is about the schedule in its entirety. And this isn't about whether or not which games I think they'll win or they'll lose. This is what I think will be the most important road games of the season for the Florida Gators. And I wanted to talk about this because while there are many criticisms that have been levied against Billy Napier for his play calling, how sometimes he doesn't necessarily make moves with great urgency throughout the season, off season, or excuse me, not the off season. There are no off season in college football, but throughout the calendar years in college football, where spring practice and summer camp, and how sometimes Florida takes it slow and steady in recruiting, how they're very slow and steady in making staff hires, how they're slow and steady in their processes, because Billy Napier is about the process and getting things right rather than just, getting them done just to get them done quickly like that. He wants to make sure that they're the efficient moves and all this that he preaches about since he's been the head coach at Florida. He's had criticisms about being stuck in his ways and not willing to adapt and evolve. And I think some of them are valid. He's also had criticism for some of the bad losses that he's had at Florida, Miami this year. The heartbreaking loss to Tennessee, and losing to Vanderbilt in their first year, and the way your first two seasons ended when it looked like you were on pace to end on a really good stretch, and then it looked like things were bleak when Florida was at 4-5, and then they ended their season winning their final four games. And this and that and this and that. But the one criticism that I don't think gets talked about enough is how bad he is on the road. Yes, I understand he had 8-5 season. Yes, I've defended his recruiting and his talent evaluations. And yes, I've defended him in the sense of, not getting too emotionally high-strung during games. And you kind of do want your head coach to, stay cool, calm, and collected in high-pressure situations. And I'm not saying, him going 8-5 last year takes away all the other criticisms that I've just mentioned. But the biggest criticism that I think that doesn't get talked about enough is how bad he is on the road. His first season at Florida, he only won one road game. That was at Texas A&M. 2022, the Texas A&M Aggies were one of the most disappointing teams in college football that year. 5-7, missed the bowl game. They were coming off of one of the best recruiting classes that was ever put together in college football modern history. They had so many great players at so many different positions, and it went to snot because, they just didn't perform to the level that they needed to, losing to Appalachian State, even though they were ranked in the top 10. Jimbo Fisher meddling, just being too involved in the offense and waiting way too late to hire a respectable offense coordinator, and just not winning enough big games at Texas A&M. They went 5-7 that year. The next year, he only won one road game again. That was at South Carolina, and South Carolina may not have looked as bad as the record would indicate. They had Spencer Rattler, who had a pretty nice final season in Columbia, South Carolina. And I thought he was probably the reason why South Carolina won 4 games. Otherwise, they probably would have been worse that season. And then this past year, in 2024, Billy Napier wins 2 road games for the first time in his career. But the problem is, it was Florida State, who was 2-10, and I think Mississippi State, who was 2-10 as well. I'm just gonna quick look up Mississippi State's record just to be sure, but I think both of those teams are 2-10. Yeah, both of these teams are 2-10. The only difference is that Florida State won a conference game against Cal, and Mississippi State, on the other hand, was 0-8 in conference play. That's really about it. That's the only difference between those two. There's not a true signature road victory on Billy Napier's resume. The South Carolina victory felt good at the time because it was heading into the bye week and Florida went 5-2, and it was a hard-fought game by both teams, and South Carolina gave Florida a run for their money, so it was a hard-fought victory for the Gators. But it wasn't a signature victory for the team in terms of significance when you looked at the opponent and how they finished the season. Florida got their victories against LSU and Ole Miss. Those were signature victories because those teams were ranked at the time. Ole Miss, the best win in Napier's career, was in the top 10, knocking them out of the playoff race. Well, really knocked both Ole Miss and LSU out of the playoff race because heading into the Florida and LSU game, the Tigers still had a chance to make the college football playoff through conference play. And, Florida, not only that, but Florida, Billy Napier did finally get a victory against Kentucky for the first time. So he's no longer winless against Kentucky. He still has a losing record to Kentucky, but he's not winless anymore. 1-2, and blowing them out in a way that he was kind of supposed to. Kentucky was not very good. Getting a victory against UCF, who they weren't very good either, but there was a rivalry brewing between the fan bases, and both of those fan bases were desperate for their team to win. If you go back to the Florida UCF game, when at the opening kickoff, UCF fans were probably as loud in the stadium as any opponent on the road has been at the Swamp during Billy Napier's tenure. So I consider that a nice win for him. I consider UCF and Kentucky nice wins considering the circumstances that surrounded both of those games. But he does not have a signature victory on the road. And in this video, we'll be talking about what could be the biggest road victory for him in his career. Florida's on the road 5 times this year, and they only have 6 home games. They're on the road 5 times. They have their neutral game against Georgia, so this will be a good year for him to get some good, pretty good victories on the road. At number 5, I think the most critical road game, the 5th most critical road game on the season for Billy Napier, is November 8th on the road, Kentucky Kroger Field. The reason why I believe that is because, Kentucky has a winning record against Billy Napier, like a lot of teams in the SEC. And it's unacceptable for any head coach at Florida to have a losing record to Kentucky. Well, Billy Napier has that. And in beating Kentucky on the road is what's needed, especially when you look at the time in which that game is being played. It's right after Georgia and right before another opponent who I'm going to talk about next. But Kentucky has had Florida's number for majority of the last 6 or 7 years. I think Florida is 3-4 against Kentucky over the last 7 seasons. They just they were recently on a 3-game losing streak to Kentucky, and by virtue of the victory over Kentucky last year, Florida now just needs to end their losing streak to Kentucky on the road. Kentucky got blown out by Florida last year, 48-20, and it's probably been a long time since Kentucky players or the Kentucky fan base has felt a loss to UF in quite some time. So I'm pretty sure they want revenge. And when Florida's in town, Kentucky fans sell out. Like, Kentucky fans really, because of the 31-year win streak that the Gators at one point had over the Wildcats, the Wildcat fan base obviously has developed kind of a hatred towards Florida because it's like the kid in school that's constantly getting bullied and pushed around, and he's finally, hitting puberty and is growing up a little bit and finally has a little bit more strength to now fight off that bully. And that's kind of what Kentucky has been to Florida, is that kid that's finally getting one up on the bully after getting beat down by him so many times. So that's the fifth most critical game on the road for me. The next one is Ole Miss. That's a week after the Kentucky game. They play back-to-back. That's November 15th. And that is at, I'm trying to name the stadium here, that's at Vaught-Hemingway Stadium. And that's on November 15th. And that's before Florida finishes their season with home games against Tennessee and Florida State. And that, to me, is the fourth most important game because I'm pretty sure Ole Miss wants to have that revenge game. Ole Miss was a playoff caliber team, but they had 2 bad losses to, respectfully, a middle-of-the-road Florida team and a really bad Kentucky unit. That was 4-8, but Kentucky had their biggest win of the season, beating Ole Miss on the road. So I'm sure Ole Miss has those 2 games highlighted for revenge for the Rebels and their fan base, and they're going to get both of those games they'll be on the road at Kentucky, but they'll be home for Florida. They played Florida in the Swamp this last winter. So they're going to want revenge for that one. It's Lane Kiffin against Florida again. There's been talk throughout last year that if Florida were to fire Billy Napier, would Lane Kiffin be the number 1 target for the Gators? in the head coaching search. Well, he's 0-1 to Billy Napier. So if he can't beat Billy Napier, that may have impact. If he can't beat Billy Napier and Florida chooses to move on anyway, that might decrease his attractiveness for the Gator administration to hire him as a coach. Not that I'm saying Billy Napier is definitely going to get fired this year. We'll see, but that game could have major implications for both coaches heading forward. And Florida will be in the midst of a tough 5-game streak to end the season. They get Georgia, they get to Kentucky and Ole Miss, both of those teams on the road, and then they'll finish with Tennessee and Florida State at home. So that's a big time for Florida to, start, picking up the pace towards the end of the season if they want to push for a playoff appearance. This one is number 3, even though I could argue it could be number 2. I wouldn't disagree with somebody who said who may would. Let me rephrase that. I put it at number 3, but at the same time, if somebody were to tell me I should put it at number 2, I can't really fight them on that. That's September 20th, Hard Rock Stadium to Miami. For obvious reasons, it's Miami and Florida, state rivals. Miami went into the swamp and embarrassed Florida 41-17 in the first time these two teams have played each other in years. So it's the rematch. If you hear a car alarm, there's a car going off in my where I live at. Miami embarrassed Florida 41-17. Just bad performance by the Gators all the way around. Offense, defense, special teams. Miami's players after the game went to the recruit session, a section of the crowd where the recruits are. I would tell them, "Hey, don't come to Florida, come to Miami," and we couldn't really argue that, and rightfully so because they just beat Florida 41-17 in front of those recruits. I still believe to this day that it's the worst loss of Billy Napier's career, and he's had some bad losses, but this one to me was the worst of them all. 41-17 to Miami with all the off-season build-up that there was from both programs and both fan bases, and you just know that each fan base is going to remind each other of this. The Miami fan base is going to remind Florida of this every opportunity that they get. So this is a big revenge game for Billy Napier, and I think it would really be good behoove of him to not only win this game, but do it in a dominant fashion and get payback. The Hurricanes are going to have Carson Beck, who's undefeated against Florida during his time at UGA. It's going to be. I don't think Miami will be as explosive offensively because of all the talent that they lost in the offensive weaponry. Running back Damian Martinez is gone. They lost quite a few receivers in Xavier Restrepo and Jacoby George, I believe. Jacoby George is his name. Yes, Jacoby George, Elijah Arroyo. There was the tight end. There was another wide receiver. I think it was Sam Brown from Houston. He's leaving Miami as well. And obviously Cam Ward, Jalen Rivers, a longtime starting offensive lineman, is gone from Miami. So quite a few pieces on that offensive side of the ball for the Hurricanes are going to be gone. And facing them at that time of the year, you'll get at least a few good games to see where that team is at, as opposed to facing them week 1 and having a complete mystery of the kind of tape that you can expect to see on the football field. And that's why I have that game number 3. But if some people wanted to argue with me and say it probably should be number 2, I wouldn't be too against that. I can understand where they're coming from. Number 2, October 11th, Texas A&M, Kyle Field. So Florida is heading back to Texas A&M. I don't know why the SEC is so committed to having the Aggies and Gators play each other, because neither fan base really seems to be excited to play one another. This is a rematch of last year for Texas A&M, like Miami 2 weeks prior, embarrassed Florida on the road, and this is where I thought Billy Napier was a dead man walking at UF, and I just thought, it's time for UF to find another head coach. But like I said earlier, he bounced back from that season and ended it on a good note to come back in 2025. It's a lot later in the season as opposed to week 3, so there'll be more game footage for the Gators to study on the Aggies. Marcel Reed is the projected starter, and you kind of saw last year Marcel Reed kind of took off hot at first, but when teams had more game footage on him, they were able to attack what his deficiencies are and what his weaknesses are, and you kind of saw why Texas A&M, slowed down towards the end of the season. Texas A&M finished the season like the complete 180 of what Florida did. Florida finished winning their last 4 games of the season. Texas A&M for 2024 started off hot. They were at one point a top 10 unit, But then when you look at the way they ended that season, I'm pulling it up here. They lost 4 of their final 5 football games. They got blown out by South Carolina. They lost a close one to Auburn. They lost a slugfest with Texas, and they had a big lead over USC. But then, excuse me, they gave that game away 35-31 in the Las Vegas Bowl. So Texas ending it on a 4 out of 5 losing streak, while Florida ended on a 4-game winning streak. This was a tale of two halves between a couple of teams that ended their seasons in completely different directions. And I think beating Texas A&M would probably be better than beating them in 2022. We'll see how Texas A&M fares out throughout the rest of the year, but I just think this game has a little bit more importance when you consider it's right after the Texas game. So Florida will play LIU, USF, LSU, Miami, those two, LSU, Miami on the road, and then after their bye week, they get Texas. So if Florida comes out of the gate losing 2 of those 3, that Texas A&M game to me is a must-win to keep that season from capsizing. So if they lose that one and they go lose 3 out of 4, that might spell the beginning of the end for Billy Napier's time at UF. So it's really important that I think Florida really has to go on the road here and really show out, because these 3 teams together, even with the bye week in between LSU, Miami, and Texas, that's a pretty tough stretch right then and there. And then, of course, I've already mentioned them, the LSU Tigers. That, to me, is the most important game road game of Billy Napier's career. It's Tiger Stadium, but I'm calling it Death Valley because it deserves that respect. Many programs have gone into Death Valley and have lost big games in which ended their seasons, and it will be much earlier in the season. It's week 3. It's September 13th. Man, Florida beating LSU on the road would be a big feather in Billy Napier's cap. I actually wouldn't even care if it was in the daytime or in the nighttime. Obviously, beating in LSU in the nighttime typically has more significance, but I think this would be the most important game on the road game of Billy Napier's career, and I think it would be a good litmus test for how they're going to handle the tough competition: Miami, Texas A&M, Georgia, and Ole Miss, and Tennessee towards the end of the season. So I think that's a pretty big, important game for Florida that early on in the season. Garrett Nussmeier's coming back for the LSU Tigers. DJ Lagway beat him head-to-head, but every year is different. LSU seems to have made some moves to get better on the defensive side of the ball, because that's really what's been killing LSU the last few years. They've had the offenses, but the defense has lacked. And LSU under Brian Kelly, at some point, Brian Kelly's going to have to start challenging for some playoff races during his time at LSU, because you left Notre Dame for LSU because you said it's going to be easier to win at LSU, or at least easier at LSU to compete for titles than it is at Notre Dame. But your successor just went to a national title game, while you at most have your biggest highlight was getting blown out by Georgia in the conference title game, even in a 12-team format. So, no, excuse me. You haven't made the college football playoff yet in a 12-team format like Florida has, but Brian Kelly really has to start winning some big games to get rid of that big game choker label as a head coach at LSU, because you're not going to get the same leeway at Notre Dame than you do LSU. The previous 3 head coaches at LSU have won national titles. You need to start winning some big games too. So that's my breakdown for what the big games are on the road for Florida this upcoming season. I have Kentucky 5, Ole Miss 4, Miami 3, Texas A&M 2, and LSU 1.